Good morning, my name is Mark Sondrini. Today is Friday, April the 15th, 2016. I was born November 11th, 1945, of my father, Alvarado Sondrini, a former U.S. Navy signalman stationed aboard the Susan B. Anthony during World War II, and my mother, Betty Jane Stafford Sondrini, who was a housewife from Indianapolis, Indiana. I lived with my parents in North Adams, Massachusetts, Indianapolis, Indiana, Speedway, Indiana, Terre Haute, Indiana, and Columbus, Ohio, as my father's job changed and we were relocated. During that time, I was joined by 4 sisters and 1 brother, seemingly every time we moved. Since central Indiana was the location of most of my mother's family, 3 sisters, younger sisters, and 2 younger brothers, we spent an enormous amount of time with the extended family, and on summers we would go to North Adams to visit with my father's family. Today, as my parents live in Largo, Florida, and all of my siblings live somewhere in Florida, my mother's sisters, 2 surviving sisters, also live in Florida. My 1 sister lives in Columbus, Ohio. She's the only exception. Children live in Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Georgia, and Daphne, Alabama. After high school, I was accepted at Rose Polytechnic Institute, and I studied electrical engineering until I discovered that differential equations, which was very important to electrical engineering, was something that I couldn't handle very well. I also discovered that some of the magnetic principles of motors and generators seemed more like smoke and mirrors to me, and I soon D'd out and ended up joining the Navy. I wanted to be an astronaut ever since I heard about the U.S. space program back in the 60s. However, I discovered that to be an astronaut, you had to be a military jet pilot in the beginning, and my poor eyesight and marginal balance ruled that out. After that, I found out that being an engineer or a doctor offered a path to becoming an astronaut. I opted to be an engineer. Science and mathematics was always easy for me. History, English, foreign languages were more difficult, or less interesting, and so I didn't pay much attention to them, and so I didn't do very well in them. Well, since then I've discovered that history and English are both very important, and I've been trying to catch up to learn as much as I can of the 2 subjects. After 4+ years in the Navy on an aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Tonkin, I was accepted at Ohio State School of Engineering, where I studied mechanical engineering. I decided on that because it's a little bit less rigorous mathematically than electrical engineering, and I felt I could get through that, and I did. I graduated in the spring of '74 and went to work for a small medical device company in Columbus, as a design engineer. I grew with that company through engineering manager and ultimately the director of regulatory affairs. After 16 years with that company, I decided that I wanted to be an engineer again, so I took a job with a porous plastic company outside Atlanta, where I was a project engineer for them. After 6 years, I took a position with a laboratory supply company in Chicago as their project engineer, and then 2 years later I was recruited to an injection molding company as their engineering manager. 2 years later I changed companies again, this time for a company that specialized in automotive components, where I learned new technologies around the automotive industry and new procedures that they required. As the automotive economy turned down, I changed companies to one who did injection molding of entertainment components. There I learned to paint plastic and to assemble plastic components into larger assemblies. That company was bought 2 years later, which was a bit of a shock, and I ended up moving across town to a small molding company who was part of a very large packaging corporation based out of South Carolina. To South Carolina to be one of their corporate tooling engineers to source injection molds from around the world for their molding facilities. 4 years later, I retired, moved to Ruskin, Florida to be with family, and I now spend my time basically writing. From as soon as I could read, I submerged myself in science fiction. I read almost all of the classics and most of the modern science fiction writers. I can't emphasize enough how much my background in reading a lot of science fiction has affected my style. I've often read and heard that you should write what you know. I know science, math, space, and that's what I write about. As I've begun to mature as a writer, I've discovered that just science and technology doesn't make a good story. You have to have human qualities to it as well. And so I'm developing more and more of those qualities into my stories. I feel my greatest achievement to date has been the publication of 6 of my books. 3 short story science fiction collections, 1 science fiction novel, 1 juvenile novel, mystery novel, and 1 adult mystery novel. My goal for future is to find an agent who will then be able to push my work or help me get my work through traditional publishing. I married as I got near the end of my naval career, and we moved to Columbus, Ohio, so I could go to Ohio State and she could teach. About 5 years later, we had a son, and I got involved with my first real job. About 8 years later, problems that we had bubbled to the surface, and we divorced. 30 years ago, I remarried and had received 2 stepsons and a stepdaughter. And we moved to Atlanta, Georgia with my job. And we lived there for 6 years, where we managed to get all 3 through high school. To this day, one of my greatest regrets is losing contact with my son, who lives in Columbus, Ohio. At my age, I know that I'm never going to actually make it into space. However, through my stories, I feel that I've gotten there, and that has given me some measure of good feeling. I tried to live by Harry Callahan's motto of "a man's got to know his limitations." But I also believe that Stephen King's advice to just write is the best advice any author, any aspiring author, can follow. Along that line, some of the authors I most admire are Mr. King and his suspense novels, Isaac Asimov in almost anything he writes, science fiction or other, James Clavell in his Asian series, and Victor Hugo with his very complex world generation, Crichton with his technological thrillers. Honesty with myself is my guiding principle whenever I'm writing. I don't want to just make something up. I want to get the details right. And I do a lot of research into clothing, period, whatever, to get those details right for my. If I was asked to give today's youth some advice, I would tell them, get your head out of the phone and pay attention to the world. The second thing would be to not burn bridges. The third thing would be to understand that your parents get smarter the older you get. Also, follow your dreams by preparing for them. If asked about my favorite things in books, I would say Stephen King's The Stand or his Dark Tower series, Isaac Asimov's The Robot series, Michael Crichton's State of Fear or Timeline, James Clavell's great Asian series, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Those are all very great books. My favorite movies are 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, Blade Runner, and Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. Some of my favorite TV shows also tend to be series. The Battlestar Galactica, the new version, not the old 70s stuff. 24, Lost, Fringe. Those are some of my favorite. Since I don't really believe in an afterlife, and I believe that you have to make the best of what you've got here now, if I had 3 wishes that could be granted, and they would come true, then I would wish for continued health so that I could continue to write. I'd wish for a publisher to discover me, and I'd wish for continued health for my family and that they would stay together. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you've learned something about me. I hope it's been interesting and not totally boring.